Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little more fragrant and far older than its headlines. Marijuana, a plant that has soothed, scandalized and shaped lives across millennia. Forget the lazy stoner jokes and glossy dispensary ads. Its true story winds through incense-filled temples, apothecaries, naval voyages, and courtroom steps. Sometimes medicine, sometimes menace. The truth is, you probably wouldn't last a day trying to untangle its past, drop you into the wrong era or the wrong legal system, and what healed could just as easily condemn. Take a second to like and subscribe if this is the kind of content you enjoy. And in the comments, share your location and the time where you are. I love seeing how far and wide our community reaches. Silence your notifications, take a deeper breath, and let's begin. The plant we call cannabis began, as many old things do, simply, as a wind-borne seed on the steppe. A tall, unassuming stalk rising from thin soil beneath a wide sky. Nothing yet known of names or laws or sermons about it. Only the practicality that it grew where others sometimes did not. That its fibres could be pulled into cordage, its seeds eaten or pressed for oil, its flowers left to dry. Pale threads of evidence in pottery impressions and cord fragments, in charred seeds from hearths and in the Nacode preserved in modern leaves, gradually point one toward a picture of origin that is not mythic, but slow and migratory. Hemp like a companion to the first settled communities of Eurasia, appearing in the archaeological record in Neolithic China and in the buried holdings of Bronze Age steppe peoples, domesticated not in a single flash but in stages, selected by human hands for fibre, for seed, and sometimes, where the climate and market and taste favoured it, for resinous potency. In those early centuries, the decisions that changed a species were small and pragmatic. Tall, straight culms favoured by a weaver who needed rope that would not kink. Bushy, resin-rich plants saved by a healer seeking a more potent balm. Over generations, those decisions etched themselves into the plant's genes, producing by degrees the varieties we later called hemp and the drug types that carried the intoxicating resins prized in other places. If you listen to the bones of the earth, you hear where it first walked. In the loess soils of northern China, in the Yellow River Basin, archaeologists have found fibres and seeds from as far back as 6,000 years ago, in cultures such as Yangshao and Hemudu, where hemp appears in the toolkit of Neolithic farmers who are already weaving kindling into cloth and cord. Across the western steppe, in graves sunk into permafrost, the Pazyryk peoples of the Altai, who slept beneath felt rugs and carved wood and tattoos, left evidence of a different conversation with the plant. Not just stalks for rope, but residues in braziers and containers that smell of smoke and ceremony when you read them with a microscope. The Tarim Basin, that long corridor along the Proto-Silk Road, gave up the Yanghai grave in the early 21st century, a looter's hole in a mound opened by archaeologists who found, intimately, almost an entire stash of dried cannabis. The plant lying in that tomb, dated to roughly the first millennium BCE, perhaps 2,500 years back, seemed unusually rich in the very compounds that tug at consciousness, suggesting selection not merely for rope, but for something else. Victor Mayer and colleagues wrote about it with the giddy care of scholars who have discovered an old friend doing something unexpected. Their careful lab work suggested people in that part of the world were cultivating cannabis for ritual inhalation, and before the graves were written of by modern tongues, Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described Scythian tents filling with hemp vapour. Men leaping like the tops of their heads were being pried open. He watched steam and smoke and came away with the knowledge that in other lands, smoke had a sacred and cleansing role. Botanically, later centuries would fold the plant into the Linnaean order. Carl Linnaeus in 1753 confided the plant to the page as Cannabis sativa, neat and taxonomic in the first edition of Species Plantarum. A few decades later, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, cataloguing things from the East Indies at the Jardin des Plantes, proposed cannabis indica for the bushier, resin-rich plants of India. Through the 19th and 20th centuries, botanists added ruderalis and tinkered with subspecies. Into this taxonomy went the messy human history of breeding and migration. Modern genetic studies, those quiet mining of genomes in the 21st century, have shown what farmers and herders knew intuitively. There are at least two broad lineages, one selected for long fibres and plentiful seed, usually the stately lanky plants of temperate fields, another selected for compact resinous flowers in the mountains and warm valleys where people prize smokable buds or the sticky resin that would be scraped into hashish. The evidence is not a single tidy tree, but rather a braided skein. Gene flow across populations, multiple centres of domestication or at least of differentiated use, and human culture steering plant evolution as surely as the sun steers the seasons. The uses that early humans found were as varied as the landscapes they occupied. Fibre came first and everywhere. Twine and nets, sails and tent bindings, stirrups and horse tack, as societies began to move long distances and to take to ships. Hemp fibre held empires together, literally in some eras, as ropes on Roman galleys and later on Viking ships and Chinese junks. In China, hemp fibres entered even the making of paper. While the invention of paper gets tied to Kowloon in the 2nd century CE, the fibres used underneath that innovation were often linen and hemp rags, the vegetable memory of a hardy plant woven into the first pages of bureaucracy and poetry alike. Seed and oil were not raw materials alone. They were food and lamp. Pressed oil furnished kitchens and lamps that kept watch long into the night. Seeds were toasted for a nutty taste, ground into porridges and added to stews where calories mattered, and variety was a small joy. Where their climates allowed, people dried flowers and used them as medicine, to make a salve, to scent a bath, to dress a wound. It is telling that the first human attention to the plant is pragmatic. Rope to hold a horse, seed to keep a belly warm. And yet, always, there was the other thread. Plant's resin, sticky and dark, a bewildering alchemy when placed near heat. That resin would change the plant's social fate. In valleys with sun-baked hillsides, in the Hindu Kush and the Caucasus, in the terraced fields of the Himalayas, people favoured plants with dense flowers and copious trichomes, glands heavy with the terpenes and cannabinoids that would later be named, one by chemists who did their naming, long after the first farmers were dead. The distinction between industrial hemp and intoxicant cannabis is a human taxonomy as much as a botanical one, and it dates back to the slow arithmetic of need, rope and sails in one place, intoxication and ritual in another. From those separate selections sprang the two primary faces of cannabis that history would come to recognise. That recognition travelled along the routes that rewove the ancient world: trade, conquest, pilgrimage, and migration. The Silk Road was not merely a corridor for silk. It carried seed and strain, rope and recipe, smoked vapour and a handful of words that would turn into new names in new tongues. In Sanskrit, the plant is ma, or bang, in Chinese ma, in Greek cannabis, and in Arabic hashish, each a small etching of the plant into language. Words carried with caravans and with physicians who read foreign texts, whose libraries meant pharmacies, and whose recipes for ointments and potions became the scaffolding of early pharmacology. Those recipes and the medical registers where they were kept are the next delicate chamber of this story. Medicine writes slow, and so do the minds that register it, sometimes through myth, sometimes through clinical observation, sometimes through the translation of one dead language into another. In China, the law that coalesced around the plant is as old as the medicinal tradition itself. The figure who looms large here, a part myth, part cultural ancestor, is Shen Nong, the divine farmer, who in tradition is said to have tasted hundreds of herbs and catalogued their effects. Attributed to him is a pharmacopoeia later collected as the Shenong Benkao Jing, a manuscript whose current form dates from the early centuries of the Common Era, but which claims a lineage reaching back to legendary prehistory. In its classifications, cannabis appears respected as a useful plant, seeds as nourishment, flowers as medicine. Later, the great pharmacopoeias of imperial China, notably Li Shizhen's Compendium of Materia Medica in the Ming era, would treat cannabis with the encyclopedist's caution, recording uses for constipation, as a diuretic in some formulas, and as an ingredient in topical plasters that were rubbed over swelled joints. To the south, on the subcontinent, the plant's history weaves into the very threads of sacred and domestic life. The Vedas, some of the oldest preserved hymns in the Indo-European family, contain the name Pang or Panga among lists of plants, and the Atharva Veda in particular treats the plant with ambivalent reverence. Named as a herb that dispels fear, it is also set among plants that relieve suffering. In the long compendia of Ayurveda, the Karaka Samhita and the Sushruta Samhita, layered texts compiled and recodified from the first millennium BCE into the early centuries CE, cannabis is catalogued as a therapeutic when used carefully, an aid for pain, as a digestive stimulant or sedative in certain formulations, as part of poultices and anaesthetic mixtures for surgical work. The surgeon Sushruta, whose aphorisms about cutting and cautery read like a kind of grim, intimate poetry, mentions substances used to blunt pain and to make incisions survivable. In such lists, cannabis plays a role alongside other botanical actors, a plant used with care and mixture rather than as a blunt instrument. Egypt's great medical scrolls, the Ebers Papyrus, dated around 1550 BCE, speaks in recipes that mix magic and empiricism. There, among frankincense and other aromatics, scholars have argued for the presence of cannabis in certain prescriptions, particularly for treating eye conditions, inflammation, or labour pains. Direct proof is patchwork and linguistic, and scholars debate the exact meaning of some ancient words. Even so, the presence of plant-based medicines in Egyptian pharmacology indicates a common pattern. Societies everywhere learned empirically which plants seem to dull pain, shed fever, staunch bleeding, or relax the body for childbirth, and they wrote those observations down in recipes that would, when possible, be copied and carried to another culture. The Greeks and Romans took their own particular look. Herodotus, that curious wanderer of the 5th century BCE, more than once described foreign customs with glee and amazement, and in his account of the Scythians he detailed hemp baths. He watched men throw seed upon hot stones inside wool tents, and inhale the vapours until eyes and throats opened to a new light. Later pharmacologists collaborated these observations into medical systems. Dioscorides, a Greek physician serving the Roman army in the 1st century CE, included cannabis in De Materia Medica as a plant useful for treating earache, the root in particular for syringing into ears, and as an ointment to relieve pain and remove corns. Pliny the Elder, in his vast natural history written in the 1st century CE, commented on hemp's multiple uses, the strength of its fibres, the nutritional value of its seed, and also its medicinal employment. Galen, who did so much to standardize humoral medicine in the 2nd century CE, included plant-based analgesics and topical agents that physicians could reach for when treating swellings and pains. The logic that shaped their pharmacology was often pragmatic. What relieves an ache? What reduces swelling? The answers were empirical, passed from field to hospital to writing desk. Where the Roman roads and Greek letters could not carry the knowledge, translators did. The translation movement of the Abbasid caliphs in 9th century Baghdad made the Greek pharmacopoeia new again in Arabic. Doctors such as Al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes, 865-925 CE, and Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna, 980-1037 CE, preserved and expanded that knowledge in great compendia. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, a text that would govern European medical study for centuries after its Arabic original was translated into Latin, lists cannabis among many substances useful for treating pain and swelling, and physicians in Cordoba, Cairo and Baghdad would use cannabis-based preparations in their clinics. Ibn al-Bayta, the Andalusian botanist of the 13th century, compiled a massive pharmacopoeia listing plants and their uses across Islamic lands. His pages attest to a Mediterranean and North African knowledge of the plant, where tinctures and oils were prepared by apothecaries who measured doses with the care of men who knew how easily an herb's medicine became mischief. The procession of words shows the pattern of transmission: Sanskrit, Chinese, Greek, Latin, Arabic, and with it a translation of pharmacology from one script to another, the pragmatic knowledge of how much and when transmuted through generations. The preparations were many: poultices, crushed leaves laid on swollen joints, unctuous salves imbued with the plant's oils for cracked skin, decoctions and teas brewed for labour pains or gastrointestinal distress, inhalations or steam baths to ease the painful chest, and, in some traditions, more daring concoctions used as anaesthetics for the badly wounded or operated upon. Often these treatments were not simple single-herb remedies, but mixtures, balancing the humours and tempers of the patient as a Greek physician might balance hot and cold. The scale of production mattered. The apothecary who made a little bottle for a local magistrate or a temple surgeon had to supply consistent doses. For that consistency one needed knowledge of plant varieties, of the season and soil conditions that changed potency, and of the logistics of storage and transport. It was a craft half alchemy, half bookkeeping. If medicine drew down the plant into measured use, religion and ritual lifted it into the other world. There is something about smoke that invites the sacred, the way it fills a space and then leaves, insulating a community for an hour of altered perception. In the thin air among the Pazyryk and Scythians, the archaeologist Sergei Rudenko in the 1920s uncovered objects that, when read now with modern chemical tests, suggest a ritual use. Wooden braziers and stone basins with residue that smelled faintly of burnt plant, and perhaps of more than domestic smoke. Herodotus's tent became archaeological fact in such places where seed and charred remains matched the description of steam rituals. We can close our eyes and see it. A nomad's tent, soft light from a lamp, men pressing damp seed on red stones until the papery vapour blooms like incense, laughter and a ceremonial loosening of social strictures, not mere pleasure but practice, a technology of the liminal. Across the Iranian plateau and into the Indian subcontinent, the ritual story becomes thicker and more contested. The Indo-Iranian ritual drink Hauma in the Avesta and Soma in the Vedas occupies a mythic place in histories of religion. It is a pressed plant offering that confers divinity, strength, or ecstasy. What exactly Soma or Hauma was remains disputed. For some scholars, cannabis is an attractive candidate. It appears in the Indian textual and folk corpus as a sacred plant, and medieval texts sometimes connect bhang with divine intoxication. Others propose ephedra, the fly agaric mushroom, or other candidates. The debate is lively and instructive because it shows how spiritual technology and botanical reality rarely match perfectly in the distant past. The plant people worshipped might be a blend, or the ritual might change species as cultures migrate. What is clear, though, is that by the medieval period cannabis had become a devotional agent in India, given to Shiva, drunk at Holi in sweetened milk as bhang to rupture the self into festivity, smoked by sadhus who sought transcendence and detachment from the world's anxieties. This was profoundly a community ritual. The powder passed from hand to hand, a small sacrament in festival light. In the Islamic world, the plant story loops with doctrinal struggle and mystical practice. Islam's early texts prohibit alcohol, though not every intoxicant equally. Cannabis entered Islamic lands as both a medicinal herb and, by the later medieval centuries, as hashish, a resinous concentrate that medieval Arabic texts name readily. Some Sufi orders, the ecstatic antinomian fringe of Islam's mystical tradition, at times adopted hashish as an instrument for achieving states of ecstasy that music and dance otherwise supplied for more orthodox devotees. Medieval polemicists seized upon the association. The word hashishiyya became a slur and, for some, a shorthand for radicalism. The Nizari Ismailis of Alamut, called by their enemies the Hashashin, entered legend through accusations that they used hashish to induce selfless devotion in their killers, a tale popularized by Marco Polo centuries later. Modern historiography tends to discount the literal truth of those stories, but accepts their rhetorical effectiveness. Enemies used the spectre of drug-induced zealotry to describe a political threat. For Sufis it was more complicated. Some used hashish, some forbade it, and for many the preferred path to union with God remained the long grind of discipline and ecstatic practice rather than a pharmacological shortcut. The Islamic jurists, the muftis and fuqaha, varied in attitude, sometimes tolerating cannabis for medicinal uses, while prohibiting recreational intoxication, sometimes issuing decrees against any form of inebriation. The debate reflects a larger truth. A plant can be both sacrament and social problem, depending on who holds the ladle. The ritual contexts were varied as the people who practiced them. In Central Asia, the braziers and temples of the steppe were simple and violent. Smoke prepared warriors for battle or priests for oracles. In the Fertile Crescent in North Africa, the plant entered the coffee houses and small homes, becoming both leisure and devout practice. Ibn Battuta, the great 14th century traveller, noted hashish in his travels and observed it in social settings that often combined humour and melancholy. In India and Nepal, bhang became a rite of hospitality and festival. Sadhus smoked ganja in small chillums and spoke of dissolving into the world and its gods. Each culture that adopted it wrapped its own symbols around the plant. In some places it stood for fertility and life. In others, a vehicle to cross the threshold into the ancestral realm, the place where healers and seers conversed with spirits. The symbolism is consistent in its contradictions. Intoxication often signifies transgression and permission at once. In ritual it is allowed because the ritual frames it. Outside the ritual it can be censored because its powers are uncontrollable. This ambivalence makes cannabis an instrument of boundary work. It erodes barriers between self and other, between the living and the dead, between pain and relief. It creates spaces in which a different social contract is possible for an hour or two. Priests and shamans know that the plant's ability to dissolve ordinary perception is a tool, and like all tools it can be used to heal or to harm, to initiate or to dissolve. Preparation and scale in ritual were as material as in medicine. Temples kept groves or garden plots. Temple servants nurtured plants to the calendar. Resin was collected by rubbing flowers between hands, a slow harvest that produced charats in the hills of Kashmir, for which the craft of producing smooth, dark resin became a form of virtuosity. Bhang preparations, meanwhile, embodied domestic ritual. Leaves are plucked and bruised, then soaked in water or milk and boiled with sugar, spices, and often nuts to produce a thick drink that is sipped communally. There is very little in the ritual use that is purely spontaneous. Even the most ecstatic ceremony followed rules, timing, division of portions, incantations, because a sham ritual is not sacred by accident. The material labour of cultivating, refining and dosing gave the plant social life, turning a simple herb into a sacrament carefully tended by generations. And always the plant kept two faces. It tied together the strands of human economy, fibre for cloth, oil for light, seed for sustenance, with the threads of inner life, medicine for pain, smoke for prayer, resin for communal ecstasy. That duality is why it is so easy to find arguments about it even in those earliest records. Those who needed rope made it an economic asset. Those who needed relief from suffering made it medicine. Those who sought to know the unseen made it sacrament. Across Eurasia, from the river valleys of China to the high passes of the Hindu Kush to the cooled rooms of the Mediterranean port, the plant adapted. People grafted human uses onto its morphology, and in turn those uses steered the plant's evolution. When you put these histories together, the domestication of a stalk for fibre, the slow selection for resinous flowers in warm hills, the careful recipes recorded by physicians in Sanskrit, Greek, Arabic and Chinese, and the smoky communal rites enacted in tents and temples, you see a map of human ingenuity and ambiguity. Cannabis is not merely a plant with properties. It is a mirror in which societies saw their needs reflected. To bind and to brighten, to numb and to open, to heal and to glimpse gods. The archaeological finds give texture. The texts give purpose. The rituals give soul. Together they make a human history that is practical and sacred, that is tangled with trade routes and with liturgies, that sometimes looks like agronomy and sometimes like poetry. It is tempting, as a historian and a raconteur, to end the tale with a neat moral about how humans domesticate more than plants, and how plants domesticate our habits in return. But history shuns tidy endings. Instead, consider this. The earliest people who pressed hemp into cord and seed into their pots could not have foreseen the juridical debates of later empires, nor the sanctimonious scorn of some future moralists, nor the pharmacies that would bottle its essence in apothecaries with Latin labels. What they saw was immediate, a strong fear, a nourishing seed, a curious vapour that changed perception, and that mixture of practical need and spiritual curiosity is what seeded a history that would span continents and millennia. The plant, patient as ever, followed human hands and climates, sometimes quietly as rope in a ship's rigging, sometimes ritually as smoke in a tent where men sought to meet the other world. In both roles it became indispensable to life's ordinary and extraordinary labours. So the story threads forward. The plant's leaves and flowers move through medicine and ritual, through writing and translation, and across empires, with each step measured by the plaited rope and by the smoke that lifts toward the rafters. The ancients wrote recipes in ink and mud. The pilgrims carried leaves in pouches. The potters noted stamped impressions of twined hemp in their ceramics. And the priests burned its smoke to reach a liminal place where the ordinary and the sacred exchange currencies. In that exchange, the plant was counted as both commodity and companion, and the record of that counting, scattered in tombs, scripted in treatises, hinted at in liturgy, is the evidence we lift now like a dim lamp to read by. The lamp sputters, and the shadows lengthen, and we see again with the gentle certainty of sleep that cannabis's earliest history was one of quiet practicality braided with occasional sacrament, a plant cultivated into being by the simple vectors of human need, curiosity, and devotion. Hemp lay at the heart of pre-industrial economies for centuries, its coarse fibres becoming rope, sailcloth, textile and paper that literally held empires together. Imagine a sailing fleet in the age before steam, hulls black with pitch, masts like forest trunks bristling with yards and shrouds, each line and say a rope of hemp, each sail a heavy canvas woven from its fibre. The Spanish Armada of 1588, the Dutch flights that fed the Republic's commerce in the 17th century, the fleets of the English Tudor and Stuart monarchs, and later the vast squadrons of the British Royal Navy all consumed hemp by the ton. Whole regions of northern Europe, Estonia, Livonia, the ports of Riga and Revel, the wooded shores of the Baltic and White Seas, were known across the continent for their hemp. The Hanseatic merchants carried bales of it from the Baltic to Bruges and Lübeck. Amsterdam's warehouses in the 17th century brimmed with hemp that would be dressed into ropes for the Dutch East India Company's ships bound for Batavia and the East Indies. Empires measured out their ambitions in cordage. If you stand for a long breath in a 17th or 18th century dockyard, Portsmouth, Chatham, Deptford on the Thames, the scene is slow and repetitive, the kind of work that gives time for thought and for laws. Rope walks stretched like long corridors along the river, where teams of men marched back and forth twisting fibres into strands, strands into ropes whose lengths had to be exact. A single ship required miles upon miles of rigging. The great cables that held anchors and brace masts needed even more. Sailcloth, called duck, from Dutch doek, was woven from hemp or linen, heavy enough to drive a vessel before the wind and durable enough to resist salt and sun. Oakum, the tarred shreds of old rope used to caulk seams, was another reclaimed product of hemp. Oakum was picked out by hand and then worked back into service, tarred and forced into the ridges of planking by caulkers' mallets. The smell in these yards was a deep maritime odour of tar and hemp dust. The sound was a low, rhythmic creak of winches and the murmur of men whose labour held the world's shipping together. States noticed. Naval power could not be improvised. Louis XIV's minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert in 17th century France organised shipbuilding and supplies. His mercantilist hand reached toward the provision of everything a navy required, hemp among them. In England, successive monarchs and governments did the same. Crown dockyards and private contractors both needed a steady flow of fibres, and when the market did not supply them, the state stepped in, encouraging and sometimes compelling cultivation. In the Dutch Republic, the needs of the Vici gave political weight to the procurement of Baltic hemp, and in Russia the transformation was even more dramatic. Peter the Great, who reigned from 1682 to 1725, founded a navy and a shipbuilding industry almost from scratch at newly built St. Petersburg. The Tsar visited dockyards, ordered that hemp be grown and supplied, and that production be organised to feed his fleets. He redirected provincial economies toward naval stores as he reorganised Russia on European lines. The logistics of empire, therefore, took root not only in arsenals and shipyards, but in ploughed fields and on riverbanks where hemp retting pools lay. The plant itself was obligingly simple, a friend of poor soils and of open spaces. Hemp was sown densely, tall and straight, its stalks competing and thus producing long, strong fibres in their outer bark. Harvested when the stalks were ripe, but before they became woody, the stems were often bundled and submerged in ponds or vats, in a process called retting. Bacterial action loosened the pith from the bast fibres. These bundles, then dried, were beaten and broken in a process of decortication, scutched to remove the broken bits, and finally hackled, combed, until threads could be spun. The machinery was minimal in the early modern period. The work demanded time and hands. Women and children were commonly engaged in the finer stages of preparation. Ropes were made in the long rope walks. Textile looms wove canvas and coarse cloth, and local workshops produced cordage of various gauges for everything from small fishing boats to men of war. Hempseed supplied oil for lamps, as well as grease and varnish for shipboard works. Nothing of the plant went entirely to waste. Because of its strategic importance, states offered incentives, tax exemptions, premiums, and sometimes outright mandates. Privileges for hemp production could be a matter of economic policy and national security. Landlords might be required to allow tenants to cultivate hemp. Magistrates might fine those who let fields lie fallow if hemp was needed. France under Colbert pursued mercantile centralisation that prioritised supplies for the royal fleet. In England, the Crown's dockyards were a ready and constant buyer. The Dutch East India Company, the enormous corporate arm of Dutch imperialism, bargained and contracted for hemp on a scale that required careful provisioning from both the Baltic and from colonial outposts. Even where enforcement was lax, the market responded. Hemp prices rose with naval demand, encouraging farmers in peripheral regions to plant the crop. Scale in this case was logistical as well as agricultural. The supply chain of hemp stretched through warehouses and flotillas of carts, through rivers where barges carried bundles to towns and ports. Contracts were long-term. A ship under construction into Chatham might be scheduled years ahead and its rigging budgeted in rope, tar and hemp. Officials kept stocks. In Britain, the Admiralty maintained depots of hemp and cotton yarns, and the royal dockyards employed specialist cordage makers and caulkers for the long task of keeping fleets sea-ready. Naval stores, tar, pitch, hemp, ropes became a distinct economy, one whose rhythms organised towns, employment and trade networks. When the demand spiked during wars like the wars of Louis XIV, the Anglo-Dutch conflicts of the 17th century, or the Napoleonic Wars, the price of hemp could define policy. Yet so much of this would change. The 17th and 18th centuries layered technologies, and the 19th century would rearrange industries in ways that made hemp less central to everyday industrial life, even as it remained useful in pockets. The single most decisive technological intervention for fibre economies was the cotton gin. patented by Eli Whitney in 1793, which made high-quality upland cotton far easier to process and hence vastly more profitable to plant, especially in the slave-dependent plantations of the American South. At the same time, the mechanization of spinning and weaving in textile mills, concentrated in Lancashire and elsewhere, favoured cotton fibres over the coarse hemp and flax that were more labour-intensive to prepare. In papermaking, the mid-19th century turned to wood pulp process, technical advances by people like Friedrich Callias and later Carl Daniel Ekman shifted paper production away from rag and hemp fibres toward abundant, machine-sliced timber pulp. Steam replaced sail. The age when hemp rigging bound the world was giving way to an age when iron and coal drove steamships and steel cables. Wire and steel began to replace hemp for the heaviest lines. Where hemp remained, it was often because old ships still needed it, or because local economies could not instantly convert. The result was a steady decline in hemp's centrality to many imperial economies. Yet its footprint would remain, and its other uses, medicinal and psychoactive, would follow different routes in different hands. While hemp's fibres bound ships and stored the merchants' cargoes, the plant's mind-altering properties travelled different roads, seeded in some lands and transformed in others. Across medieval Islam and wider Eurasia, the psychoactive forms of cannabis, resins and preparations known as hashish, karas or bang became entangled with religion, medicine and law in ways that tell us a great deal about cultures and connections. The accounts we have are a mix of travellers' astonishment, physicians' curiosity, jurists' caution and poets' metaphor. Avicenna, Ibn Sina, who lived from 980 to 1037 and whose canon of medicine would long shape medical thought, knew the plant and wrote of its effects. As medicine it could be sedative or analgesic. As a toxin it could cloud memory. Al-Biruni, his contemporary in the 11th century, travelled to India and remarked on local customs and substances, taking careful anthropological notes on bang and other preparations. Ibn al-Baytar, the 12th-13th century Andalusian botanist and pharmacologist who worked in Damascus and wrote a compendium of simple medicaments in the 1240s, catalogued cannabis among 1,000 other remedies. By these lights, cannabis was both a therapeutic commodity and an object of curiosity. Trade routes carried not only fibre and bale goods, but also ideologies and potencies. The Silk Road connected Central Asia, the steppes, the cities of Bukhara and Samarkand to the courts of Persia and the caliphal centres of Baghdad. From the Hindu Kush and the high valleys of Afghanistan came a dense resinous product, charas, hand-pressed resin, that would travel across mountain passes and into caravan cities. From India came pang, the dried leaves and flowers prepared into pastes and drinks deeply embedded in certain ritual calendars. And from the Maghreb later came kif, a mixed product with resin and tobacco. In the medieval period, these preparations moved along merchant routes and through pilgrim pathways. Mecca and Medina were meeting points, Damascus a crossroads of caravan and sea trade, Cairo a port and court where news and goods collided. The social meanings attached to intoxication were not uniform. Islamic law was clear about the prohibition of wine and the intoxicants that cause heedlessness, khamar. And yet cannabis presented jurists with a problem of categorization. Was it the same as wine, therefore forbidden, or different because it was plant and not grape? Debates proliferated. Some jurists condemned cannabis explicitly, treating its intoxication as unambiguously sinful, while others allowed it limited medicinal use. The medieval Sunni theologian Ibn Taymiyyah, 1263 to 1328, voiced strong opposition to hashish and other intoxicants, arguing that any substance which produced intoxication should be treated like wine. His voice mattered. His writings influenced many later clerics, but legal practice on the ground varied. In some quarters, Sufi practitioners, whose mystical language prized states of ecstasy and rapture, found in intoxicants a possible shortcut to spiritual experience. Sufi poetry, particularly in Persian, often turns the language of intoxication into the language of union with the divine. Whether the metaphors always concealed literal use is debated, but there were sects, calendars, and certain wandering dervishes who did sometime employ hashish as part of ritual or ecstatic practice. So the picture is ambivalent, at once medicalized, spiritualized, feared, regulated. The name that the Crusaders and later European chroniclers gave to a notorious group in the mountains of northwestern Persia, Hashashin, added to the plant's myth. Contemporary Muslim sources and modern historians both caution that the etymology of assassin is complex and contested. The chroniclers' stories that Hassan Isaba, circa 1050 to 1124, the Nizari Ismaili leader of Alamut, drugged his devotees with hashish to induce obedience may be a partly rhetorical caricature used by political enemies. Still, the legend took hold in the medieval imagination, and hashish itself became associated in popular European narrative with secret sects, fanatical followers, and exotic dangers. Reality on the ground was messier. India had ancient uses for cannabis going back into the Vedic period. Central Asian nomads chewed seeds and used hemp oils. Physicians across the Islamic world read and reinterpreted these practices through the frameworks of humoral medicine, prescribing cannabis extracts for pain, for hemorrhage, earache, or against the plague's feverish delirium. Places mattered. In Central Asian cities, Bukhara, Samarkand, Merv, cannabis was part of both the pharmacopoeia and the culture of leisure among some men. In the cities of the Levant and North Africa, the plant's use waxed and waned with political fortunes. The Mamluk sultans of Cairo, ruled by a warrior elite, found the public consumption of hashish problematic at times and cracked down in the 14th and 15th centuries. Yet enforcement was often local and intermittent. Later, under the Ottomans, hashish surfaced in legal debates and provincial ordinances, sometimes banned, sometimes tolerated, depending on how magistrates read it against the urgent needs of order and tax revenue. In the deserts and mountains of North Africa and the Atlas, many local cultivars and preparations would develop a distinctive identity. In Morocco, the word kif would come to denote both the herb and the subculture around it. There, as in many such borderlands of empire, social meaning emerged in conversation between local custom and central authority. Literature preserves attitudes that law and supply sometimes conceal. Persian poets, Hafez, c. 1315 to 1390, Rumi, 1207 to 1273, and others, wrote of intoxication constantly. Wine is the favourite tro, but the spirit of wine was a metaphor for the ecstatic union Sufis sought. Arabic literature, too, is full of warnings, jokes, and stories about the perils and pleasures of losing one's wits. Travellers such as Ibn Battuta, 1304 to 1369, recorded what they saw with a mixture of curiosity and moralizing. In India, he took note of bhang and its place in festivals. In Damascus and Cairo, he observed groups who smoked or chewed, and reported to his readers a world where, for some, cannabis was simply part of life. There was a regional patchwork, where one town's magistrates called for punishment, another's physicians might prescribe tinctures. When European imperial ambitions began to globalize commodities and peoples in ever greater volume, hemp and cannabis found themselves shifted, sometimes deliberately and sometimes by accident, into new ecological and social orders. Ships did not only carry ropes, they carried seeds, practices, and recipes. Spanish and Portuguese mariners in the 16th century brought hemp seed and fibre cultivation into the Americas as part of a broader program of transplanting familiar crops, wheat, grapes, sugarcane to colonial soils. The Manila galleons stitched the Pacific to the Atlantic, and cordage was a constant requirement. Fibre crops and alternative local fibres, like the abaca in the Philippines, which Europeans called Manila hemp, though it is not cannabis, entered imperial agricultural thinking alongside true hemp. In the English colonies of North America, hemp was present from an early date. By the 17th century it had entered colonial agriculture as a practical crop for rope and cloth. Colonists in Virginia, Maryland, New England and elsewhere experimented with varieties and processing. and hemp's reputation as a useful, resilient plant meant it was commonly planted in farm rotations. Colonial economies structured labour in ways that shaped hemp's cultivation. In the Caribbean, where sugar plantations dictated the economy, hemp did not always dominate, but where rope and sackcloth were needed, the islands produced fibre, often through enslaved labour. Jamaica and Cuba see hemp alongside other plantation crops, worked by African slaves whose labour made imperial shipping possible. In British North America, enslaved and indentured labourers, as well as free yeoman farmers, fed the hemp trade. In the Australian colonies, early 19th century officials experimented with hemp. Convict labour was sometimes directed toward the cultivation and processing of fibres for ropes and sails, as the new colonies sought to be less dependent on the metropole. The logistics were harshly pragmatic. Ports needed supplies, and colonies that could supply rope and cloth had strategic value. Empire also accelerated cultural exchange. Migrant communities carried with them both the knowledge to process hemp industrially and the recipes for cannabis as medicine and as recreational substance. The movement of Indian labourers under indenture in the 19th century reshaped the cultural map of the Caribbean and parts of Africa. From 1838 onward, indentured Indians were sent in large numbers to Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, Mauritius, and elsewhere, bringing with them bang and the social practices that accompanied it. In these new lands, ganja became a planted and used commodity among Indian diasporas, later blending into local rituals and politics. Chinese migrants, who brought opium smoking to many colonial ports, and African diasporic communities, who adapted and transmitted their own botanical knowledge, made colonial cultures unexpectedly hybrid. Medicine too took colonial shape. Dr. William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, an Irish physician working for the British East India Company in Calcutta, published in 1839 observations that introduced many in Europe and North America to the pharmacological potential of cannabis. He noted its effects in treating tetanus, rheumatism, and convulsions, and he advocated for its wider therapeutic use in hospitals. His writings ignited a genuine scientific curiosity, and in mid-19th century Europe and America, cannabis extracts entered some dispensaries and pharmaceutical books. The spectacle of elite curiosity was also more bohemian. Paris in the 1840s saw the Club des Chichins, a group that included Théophile Gautier, Charles Baudelaire, and other literary figures, meet to experiment with hashish under the recommendation of the psychiatrist Jacques-Joseph Moreau de Tours. The encounter was literary as much as chemical. The strange new sensations of a resinous foreign smoke were folded into European imaginations about the Orient and the exotic. Imperial governments did not respond uniformly. The British Imperial administration in India, confronted with widespread use of cannabis in various forms across social classes, commissioned the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission of 1893 to 1894. Its exhaustive report, interviews, surveys, and fieldwork across provinces concluded that moderate customary consumption carried little danger of the social ills attributed to it by alarmists, and it recommended regulated control rather than prohibition. The Commission's report is a singular document of colonial administration trying to translate local practices into imperial policy. Yet elsewhere, colonial rulers moved to regulate or suppress cannabis when it became entangled with visions of disorder, or when racialized fears of the colonized surfaced in metropolitan politics. French administrators in North Africa and other colonial officials adapted laws unevenly, sometimes criminalizing kiff smoking as part of wider attempts to discipline colonized populations. At the same time, the global movement of seed and know-how remade local economies. Hemp varieties dispersed, adapted, and hybridized. Colonial botanical gardens catalogued strains, while local farmers selected for fibre, leaf, or seed depending on markets and diet. In parts of Brazil and the Caribbean, enslaved Africans and their descendants used cannabis medicines and smoked resin in ways shaped by African, European, and indigenous elements. In the United States, hemp grew in household plots and larger fields. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson cultivated hemp at Mount Vernon and Monticello respectively, experimenting with different varieties and noting the labour of processing in their farm notebooks. These founding figures treated hemp as agricultural capital. They measured yields, recorded retting times, and worried about the quality of fibre, material concerns embedded in broader economic plans for expansion. And yet the forces of industrial capitalism and empire's reorientation of production made clear that cannabis and hemp would not follow a single trajectory. In many colonial ports and metropoles, the psychoactive product of cannabis became urbanized and commercialized. Sailors and soldiers, migrants and merchants met in taverns and back alleys. Hashish, charas, bang, and later blended mixtures circulated in ways that could alarm colonial magistrates and amuse romantic Parisian poets. The plant's double nature, fibre for ropes and intoxication for mind, meant that its history in the imperial age was a tale of parallel pathways, one that wound through dockyards, rope walks and warehouses, and another that edged through pharmacies, dervish lodges and cafe tables. This interweaving, industrial and cultural, botanical and bureaucratic, left enduring traces. Hemp's decline as the central fibre of empire was not immediate. It lingered wherever local conditions favoured it, and it resurged in specific moments of need, as when 20th century wars demanded alternative fibres. Cannabis's status as medicine, sacrament, and social vice would become entangled with nationalist, racial, and imperial anxieties as the 19th century gave way to the 20th. But in the centuries between medieval hashish dens and colonial rope markets, the plant had already played its contradictory roles across continents. A crop whose stalks could bind the timbers of a flagship and whose bitter, resinous smoke could loosen the strings of the mind. Empires, merchants, jurists and poets all had to make room for it, sometimes in clamorous legislation, sometimes in quiet gardens and courtyards. The story, in other words, was not merely botanical, it was logistical and emotional, tactile and legal, a crop that braided itself through the machinery of state, the rituals of the faithful, and the private therapies of those who sought to numb pain or to plumb the depths of the self. In the quiet, careful language of 19th century naturalists, the hemp plant moved from folk knowledge into the ledgered world of science, and with that movement its uses were named, measured, argued over, and turned into prescription. Carl Linnaeus had put cannabis on the botanical map in 1753, calling the tall familiar fibre plant Cannabis sativa. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, working with colonial specimens, proposed the separate name Cannabis indica in 1785 for the more resinous plants the Europeans encountered in South Asia. Those two taxonomic acts, simple and decisive, carried the tone of 19th century thought: classify, catalogue and control. Yet taxonomy did something else too. It made cannabis legible to physicians and pharmacologists who were, by temperament and training, more comfortable with Latin names than with bang or ganja. The language of the apothecary shifted accordingly. The vernacular practices of farmers and ritualists passed through the sieve of botanical description and emerged as items to be measured, extracted, distilled and, if necessary, regulated. The most consequential bridge between colonial practice and metropolitan medicine was built in the 1830s and 1840s by physicians who had spent time in India. The figure whose name will appear again and again in these pages is William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, an Irish doctor trained in Edinburgh who in the late 1830s served with the medical service of the East India Company in Calcutta and Calcutta's hospitals. He wrote down, with the empirical eye of a clinician who was also an instrument maker and an experimental chemist, what he saw: preparations of Indian hemp were used locally not merely for pleasure but for pain, for spasm, for the stiffness of rheumatism, for the shudders of cholera. O'Shaughnessy's reports, published to an eager Victorian medical readership, described clinical cases in which patients who had failed to respond to opiates and traditional remedies found relief with extracts and tinctures made from the resinous flowers and leaves. He explained methods of extraction, proposed doses, and urged that Western physicians consider these preparations as plausible toolkits for neurology and obstetrics. For a profession that prized novelty tied to evidence, his work was an invitation. Across the channel and in prison salons, the conversation took a different literary turn, but it fed back into medicine. The Club des Hachiciens, where men like Théophile Gautier, Gérard de Nerval and later thinkers sampled hashish as experiment and metaphor, produced accounts that were less sober than O'Shaughnessy's clinic notes but no less important. The psychiatrist Jacques-Joseph Moreau de Tours in 1845 published studies of hashish's psychological effects, a strangeness combined of clinical curiosity and romantic fascination, which brought the subject into the intellectual mainstream. Baudelaire and others wrote of artificial paradises, and the vocabulary hashish, hashkish, hatish entered a European imagination that alternated between exotica and pathology. Those conversations made cannabis simultaneously fashionable and suspect, a substance that could be studied by physicians, written about by poets, and feared by magistrates if it seemed to produce madness. In pharmacies, the plant acquired a marketable homely face. Victorian apothecaries with their brass scales and glass jars sold tinctures of cannabis, labelled in Latin with recommended doses to calm nerves or relieve pain, to quiet menstrual cramping or soothe the chronic cough. By the middle of the century, cannabis products were entering official formularies. In the United States and Britain, compendia and pharmacopoeias began to list extract of cannabis indica, fluid extract, and tinctures distributed by legitimate houses. Park, Davis and Company in Detroit, a name that will be familiar to anyone who has rifled through late 19th century drug catalogues, manufactured standardized extracts and sold them to hospitals and doctors. The US pharmacopoeia, by the mid-19th century, included cannabis preparations. Clinicians were not merely experimenting, they were prescribing from a recognized shelf. The language of commerce and the language of science reinforced each other. An extract had to be replicable, and the druggist who prepared it had to promise a certain strength. The catalogue of claims made for cannabis in the 19th century is strikingly modern in its range. Physicians touted it as an analgesic that in some cases could moderate the worst excesses of pain without producing the stupor associated with opium, as an antispasmodic useful in tetanus and other convulsive conditions, as an appetite stimulant for patients wasted by chronic disease, as an aid in certain kinds of neuralgias and migraines. Midwives and surgeons experimented with it as an adjunct in childbirth and in the relief of uterine pains. Asylum doctors and psychiatrists, unsure, curious, sometimes alarmed, tried it as a treatment for melancholia and mania. The claims were not always careful. The difficulties of 19th century pharmacology, varying plant chemotypes, crude extraction methods, alcohol as a carrier that masks effects, little reliable toxicology, meant that results were inconsistent. A tincture that soothed one patient could disorient another. Physicians recorded cases with the keen observational detail that made the medical casebook a form of literature, but they also fretted about dosage, purity and reproducibility. Patent medicines made the rest of the public familiar with cannabis's merchandised face. The shelves of late Victorian general stores and the catalogues of the burgeoning mail-order industry bore elixirs and tonics advertised for nervous disorders, female complaints, rheumatism, and catarrh that contained cannabis alongside alcohol and opiates. These were the remedies of a popular pharmacopoeia, sold under trade names rather than scientific ones, often combining ingredients in ways that would scandalize a later regulatory era. A mother could buy a syrup for her child's nights of crying that contained morphine and a touch of cannabis. The medical profession, increasingly professionalized and anxious about its own authority, sometimes looked on such mixtures with distaste. Doctors sought to distinguish respectable, clinically justified uses from the hucksterism of the patent market. The result was a tension. Cannabis could be both a respectable extract on a hospital shelf and a dubious ingredient in a roadside cure-all. That tension found institutional expression in the great imperial inquiries of the late 19th century. The British Indian government, under pressure from missionary groups and concerned colonial administrators, commissioned the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission in 1893 to 1804. a massive inquiry that sent investigators across the subcontinent to interview peasants, physicians, clerics, and magistrates. The commission produced a voluminous report that, to the surprise of many campaigning moralists, concluded that moderate hemp use was less injurious than feared. It made fine-grained distinctions between edible bhang, smoked ganja, and concentrated charas, and it noted social and contextual factors that shaped harm: poverty, alcohol dependence, harsh labour regimes. The Commission recommended regulation rather than blanket prohibition, suggesting that colonial governance could guard public order by taxation, licensing, and control of age and supply. The recommendations were technical, bureaucratic, unspectacular. They were also a rebuke to simplistic moral crusades of the sort that softened the ground for later, more punitive policies. Victorian social attitudes toward intoxicants shaped medical practice as much as pharmacology did. The temperance movement, increasingly powerful from the mid-19th century onward, made drunkenness a central object of moral and political reform. Alcohol was the animating demon of public life in many reform movements, and opiates later took a similar moral and regulatory disdain as their medical and social harms became visible. Cannabis, arriving in the West as an exotic import, occupied an ambivalent place in these debates. It was not the dram shop's visible social scourge, but neither was it as benign to reformers as tea. For many respectable doctors, its appeal lay in being a non-opiate option. If used carefully, they argued, it might relieve suffering, without reproducing the worst features of morphine addiction. For many moralists, however, any intoxicant that seemed associated with foreign customs, with nocturnal pleasure, or with the lower sorts should be viewed with suspicion. Science supplied language for evidence. Morals supplied reasons for caution. The two forces combined to make cannabis a credible medicine in the ledger, yet a suspect substance on the street. By the end of the 19th century, the clinical presence of cannabis had shifted from novelty to normalized item, but not without debate. Hospitals listed it under formal names, pharmacists packaged it, patent medicines marketed it. Simultaneously, the lack of chemical standardization and the rise of laboratory pharmacology, with its appetite for pure single-molecule agents, made mixed botanical extracts less fashionable. Aspirin arrived at the end of the century as an archetype of the modern pharmaceutical, a purified active ingredient, industrially produced, with a clear dose. Cannabis stood out as a mass of plant material whose active principle was not yet isolated. That absence would become a decisive factor in the 20th century. It made cannabis difficult to regulate in the new regime of chemical science and provided fuel for both advocates and opponents. The 19th century had placed cannabis in medicine. It had not, however, made it modern. The turn of the 20th century saw the science settle further and the social world darken with new anxieties. Two regulatory structures that would frame the next phase of cannabis's history were born in the 1900s, the professionalization of medicine and pharmacy under new public health statutes, and the consolidation of the modern state's capacity to police bodies and borders. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 in the United States, for example, began to impose requirements of labeling and purity that stripped at least some of the patent medicine sheen from the market. Physicians insisted on standardization. Pharmacists began to compile formularies to match a more legalistic age. Cannabis was now a drug in the book. Its destiny would be decided not merely in salons and apothecaries, but in courts and legislatures. Those legal and administrative shifts intersected with movements of people and stories across borders in the early 20th century in a way that would transform public perception. Revolutions and economic dislocations in Mexico, beginning with the uprising of 1910, pushed waves of migrants north into the American Southwest. These migrants brought with them cultural practices, including recreational and ritual uses of cannabis. In the crowded, overheated border towns, the presence of a new foreign drug became fodder for local anxieties about social order and race. Newspapers seized on these changes with relish. The immigrant word marijuana, itself a Spanish form that soon American journalists anglicized, entered headlines, and with it a series of associations, not just intoxication but violence, vice and moral degeneracy, that were rarely backed by sober social science. Sensational accounts framed cannabis as an alien threat, a foreign leaf that could bend the weak to crime. Such stories were more than print. They provided the rhetorical glue for municipal ordinances. Local politics did the rest. Across the 1910s and 1920s, town councils and city boards in the American Southwest and in a scattering of other municipalities began to pass ordinances restricting or penalising the possession and sale of marijuana. These were not all statutes drafted in Washington. They were local acts of civic anxiety, often enacted precisely where migration and racial mixing were most visible. The arrests that followed were likewise local, and, because enforcement rested in courts and police precincts, were shaped by the prejudices and priorities of local officials. In places like Los Angeles and New Orleans, where newspapermen liked lurid copy and police liked the chance to demonstrate vigilance, the legend of the drug grew faster than any sober assessment of harm. Jazz clubs in Harlem and New Orleans, smoky rooms where musical improvisation and social mixing were the order of the evening, became, in the popular imagination of the white press, hotbeds of marijuana's corrupting influence. Musicians themselves used a dozen nicknames: Muggles, Tea, Reefer, and sometimes joked about the leaf in songs. One can hear the word in a Louis Armstrong tune from the late 1920s and see it in nightclub recension. The music scene lent the drug cultural resonance. Moral entrepreneurs rewrote that resonance as danger. Immigration and race did not operate only at the level of newspapers. They affected law. Across the Caribbean and Latin America, and in colonial Africa and Asia, imperial administrators and national politicians began in the 1910s and in 1920s to contemplate the regulation of cannabis in the framework of controlling substances perceived to be public order risks. The 1925 Geneva International Opium Convention, an early moment of global drug governance under the League of Nations, extended attention to cannabis in an international legal forum. That convention did not outlaw domestic use, but it did seek to regulate the cross-border trade in hashish and encourage nations to control exports and prevent trafficking. The idea that narcotics constituted an international problem, a product of the modern administrative state and of an increasingly interconnected media environment, now included cannabis on its list. The impulse toward global control, once focused on opium and cocaine, was widening. Professional medicine in the early 20th century reacted to these currents by retrenching, and in some places by distancing itself from cannabis. The rise of specialty hospitals, of pharmaceutical companies that could produce standardized pills, and of an American medical profession increasingly allied with state regulation changed the terms of acceptability. Cannabis, unpredictable and still chemically mysterious, seemed less attractive than the new analgesics and sedatives that carried cleanly measured doses. Physicians worried not only about efficacy, but about legal risk and moral stigma. For patients whose ailments were chronic, the new pharmaceuticals promised consistency. Cannabis would, for the next decade, move further towards the margins of routine medical practice, even as it crept into nightlife and the press as a symbol of modern moral disorder. The 1930s were the decade in which those stories congealed into law. The political actor most associated with that transformation was Harry J. Anslinger, who in 1930 became the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the agency created to consolidate federal enforcement capacity against a rising panoply of substances. Anslinger was a bureaucrat with a journalist's sense of the headline and a moralist's relish for the story that tied illicit drugs to social collapse. He and his bureau mounted a concentrated public relations campaign. Anslinger testified before Congress, fed stories to newspapers, and cultivated allies among mayors and police chiefs who wanted federal backing for local crackdowns. His rhetoric was racially charged and spectacular. Newspaper clippings he circulated linked marijuana with degeneracy and with crimes allegedly committed by people of Mexican or African origin. He told lurid tales, true, exaggerated, sometimes entirely manufactured, of young men who, after smoking marijuana, had committed violence, parricide, or sexual assault. The moral imagination of his campaigns drew on older tropes about vice and foreignness. His administrative tactics turned those tropes into policy. The press amplified his voice. William Randolph Hearst's newspapers in particular were eager venues for the kind of sensational coverage that suited Anslinger's purposes, and the tabloids, local and national, lapped up stories that described the drug as an epidemic. Popular culture answered with melodrama. In 1936, a film now widely known by the campy title Reefer Madness, made in its original form as a didactic cautionary tale, depicted adolescents sliding from a single puff to ruin, robbery, madness, suicide. The film's logic was simple and its dramatization extreme. It functioned as propaganda, but an unconvincing kind, for its contemporaries as well as for later audiences who would rediscover it as kitsch. Combined with Anslinger's moralizing, the movie and 1,000 newspaper headlines produced an atmosphere in which lawmakers, already nervous about public order during the Depression and eager to consolidate authority over deviance, found legislative measures politically palatable. That political appetite took the shape of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. The act did not use the modern language of blanket criminal prohibition. Instead, Congress framed the law as a taxing and regulatory measure. Any person transferring or dealing in marijuana would have to possess a tax stamp and maintain records. Any importation would be taxed. Commercial growers and sellers would be required to register and comply. The language of the law was bureaucratic, the form of it technical, but the effect was simple and severe. Compliance was so onerous and the penalties for transgression so steep that it effectively criminalised most lawful commerce in cannabis. The act was passed after hearings in which Anslinger's bureau testified at length. It received little sustained scientific scrutiny in the sense of independent toxicological evidence. Instead, the moral weight of anecdote and the urgency of police testimony shaped the congressional record. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the measure into law in 1937, a moment that sealed the plant's legal fate in the United States for decades to come. There were larger currents feeding that legislative moment. The Great Depression had made control over social order a central political preoccupation. Prohibition of alcohol, repealed in 1933, had demonstrated the limits of national moral legislating, and the ease with which organised crime could exploit illicit markets. Marijuana, more marginal in scale, seemed a safer target on which the new federal apparatus could show decisiveness. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics had incentives too. Expanding the legal and budgetary reach of an agency requires enemies to fight and problems to solve. Law enforcement benefited from the moral clarity of a new campaign and from the public support stirred by lurid stories. Economically, there were commentators and later conspiracy theorists who argued that industrialists feared hemp as a competitor to paper, rope and early plastics. Those arguments are complicated and in part speculative. They nonetheless fed public suspicion and have been recycled in popular histories. More directly consequential was the fact that the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act coincided with the collapse of a small but real hemp fibre economy in the United States. Farmers who had cultivated hemp for cordage and cloth found their markets disappearing under the weight of legal uncertainty and the flood of cheaper imports. The immediate consequences were tangible and unequal. Users who had once occupied a space between medicine and leisure found themselves criminalised. Growers, many of whom were small family farmers in marginal areas, faced ruin or the need to abandon a crop whose market had evaporated. Indigenous and immigrant practices, from Mexican recreational use to certain Caribbean traditions, were driven underground, severing the social context in which use had been routinized and regulated by custom. For communities of colour, the enforcement of the new rule was harshly discriminatory. Arrest patterns showed a bias toward black and Latino men, who were often targeted by police and prosecutors eager to demonstrate progress in the war on drugs. The scientific community, meanwhile, saw the legal environment change the terms of research. Cannabis, which had been a legal ingredient in pharmacopoeias for almost a century, faced a new regulatory burden that chilled clinical use and slowed any systematic pharmacological investigation. The plant's removal from everyday medical practice in the United States was as much administrative as it was scientific. The tax code, the threat of criminal sanction, and the stigma of associating with marijuana turned what had once been an accepted therapeutic into a forbidden object. International echoes followed. The United States' newfound zeal influenced League of Nations conversations and persuaded other governments to tighten controls. By the late 1930s, numerous countries had adopted laws restricting production, sale, or use. Colonial administrations in Africa and Asia leaned on the example of metropolitan legislatures to justify local controls. The global architecture of drug control, which had first focused on opium and then widened to other substances, now incorporated marijuana into its orbit. The result was a patchwork of prohibitions and taxes that, while not uniform, shared a logic: criminalize supply chains to deter use and empower police to intervene. The practical effect, again, was to push traditional practices out of sight and into the penal system. There was resistance and contradiction. Not everyone accepted the new orthodoxy. Some physicians continued to argue for cannabis's therapeutic value. Small medical communities in countries where the plant had long local uses protested the heavy hand of regulation. In 1939, the mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, commissioned an investigation into the myth surrounding marijuana. The report that followed would be skeptical of the most lurid claims and attentive to the social context of use, though it did not overturn the basic contours of federal policy. The discovery of these dissenting voices mattered because it showed the limits of moral panic. It also hinted at the later cultural shifts that would re-examine the 1930s settlement. The 1930s, then, were the decade that converted cannabis into a criminal object within the United States and gave that transformation international resonance. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 stands as a technical, bureaucratic law that nonetheless had wide social consequences. It closed off avenues for clinical use, reshaped agricultural economies, and criminalized communities that had long-standing practices of consumption. The rhetoric of the era, thick with stories of contagion and degeneracy, allowed a single plant to become a symbol of the social fears of a nation struggling with migration, race, economic crisis, and the expansion of state power. It is a grimly ironic point. A plant once negotiated in the trades between apothecaries and households had, within a few decades, been pulled into the machinery of federal taxation and criminal prosecution, all while scientific chemistry had not yet answered the basic pharmacological questions that might have anchored a different policy. These 3 decades, the 19th century's careful medicalization, the early 20th century's racialized moral panics, and the 1930s legal consolidation, form a single arc. They show how a botanical subject can travel from the bench to the bedside to the court, and how scientific curiosity, commercial interest, popular culture, and political calculation can combine to make an everyday plant into a contested public object. The story is not one of inevitable progress toward prohibition. Other historical paths were available, as the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission had suggested, and as later medical reassessments would demonstrate. Instead, what happened was the outcome of particular institutional incentives, rhetorical strategies, and cultural anxieties. A bureaucracy that needed a problem, a press that needed a sensation, a political class that needed to be seen as decisive. The consequence was a pattern of regulation that would endure, with painful human costs and curious ironies, until the first serious challenges to the legal order began to appear many decades later. The 19th century had opened an avenue for cannabis as medicine and commodity. The 20th closed it with statute and story. The leaf itself, patient and indifferent, continued its slow cycles of growth and decay, unaware of the laws and speeches that bent human lives around it. When the lab lights hummed above narrow benches in the early 1960s, the work smelled of solvents and meticulous patience. It smelled of ether, of benzene, of nights spent watching flasks settle into colour and newly made crystals blink in the gloom. In that measured atmosphere, a small crucial unravelling took place. A molecule long suspected to be the psychoactive heart of cannabis was finally separated from the plant's braided chemistry and given a name and a shape. Raphael Mechoulam and his colleague Yechiel Gaoni, chemists working in Israel, published in 1964 what read like the kind of quiet revelation that changes the way people see a thing: delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, the molecule the world would often shorten to the single syllable THC. It was not the first stroke in the story of cannabis chemistry. Roger Adams and others had been isolating and tinkering with cannabinoids for decades, and cannabinol and cannabidiol had been glimpsed and sketched in chemical notebooks earlier in the century. But Mechoulam's work gave the field a focal point. Here was a defined active constituent, separable, synthesizable, manipulable. The plant's mythic green blur suddenly had a hinge, a lever. You could prod it, you could study it, you could begin to ask how it worked. The practicalities of that work are a minor epic of laboratory logistics. Tons of plant material were not required. Instead, a patient distillation and fractionation, followed by spectral analysis and synthesis, would reveal structural motifs familiar to organic chemists. The breakthrough allowed pharmacologists to move from crude extracts and folk categories into the age of receptor theory and dose-response curves. With an identifiable compound came a new vocabulary: agonist, antagonist, affinity, potency. It was as if the plant had stepped out of the folklore of markets and memories and into the sterile, hypnotic light of the pharmacological microscope. That shift did not happen in a vacuum. The Cold War era supplied both funding and a sense that biological fine-tuning could be a geopolitical advantage. Chemistry could be a national asset. Pharmaceutical firms and governments had reasons to care about nausea, appetite loss, pain, seizures, spasticity, cancer chemotherapy, wartime trauma, and the viral ravages of later decades posed clinical problems that old remedies did not always fix. The isolation of THC opened an entire program of rational drug design. Synthetic analogues were conceived, measured, and tested. The body could be interrogated pharmacologically at a level previously only dreamt of. A synthetic appetite stimulator, dronabinol, marketed as Marinol, would become a reality in later decades, offering one early demonstration of how botanical knowledge could be translated into regulated medicine. The biological promise, however, arrived at precisely the same historical instant that social and legal frames were hardening against the plant. If the 60s were the era in which chemists traced the curves of THC, they were also the decade in which marijuana found new cultural meaning. Smoke plumed in the coffee houses of Greenwich Village and the concert fields of Haight-Ashbury. The plant became a material shorthand for rebellion, for an intimacy of experience among the young who staged their descent in song and on street corners. It is important to remember that these were not simply intoxicated dreams. They were networks of people swapping ideas, music and politics, and cannabis frequently accompanied that trade. The plant was a social glue as much as a chemical stimulus. It stacked comfortably with anti-war sentiment, with sexual liberation, with folk politics, with music that travelled across the dial and into foreign influence. Governments did not respond to that new cultural role with nuance. In Washington, the rhetoric hardened into what came to be called the war on drugs. President Richard Nixon, in 1971, named drug abuse public enemy number one and centralized law enforcement responses against supply and distribution. This was the moment when a policy framework that had once been a mix of public health and prohibition crystallized into something more coercive. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 formalized a schedule system that placed cannabis into Category 1, high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use, no safe dosage. Ironic, given Mechoulam's work had already shown a molecule with measurable, repeatable effects and potential therapeutic applications. The National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, chaired by former Pennsylvania Governor Raymond Schaefer and better known as the Schaefer Commission, reported in 1972 that criminal penalties were disproportionate to the social harms of use and recommended decriminalization for simple possession. The report was thorough and polite and then promptly shelved by the administration. History has a taste for such ironies. Science quietly accumulates mechanism as politics loudly asserts prohibition. The next decade saw policy ratchet up rather than correct course. Under Ronald Reagan, the war on drugs found its muscular form. The Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 1986 and 1988 produced mandatory minimums, greater funding for law enforcement, and a vast expansion in the criminal justice apparatus focused on drugs. The language of politics hardened into phrases designed to terrify and to justify force. Zero tolerance, tough on crime. The public, watching images of streets and neighbourhoods, imagined a contagion of addiction. Policymakers imagined the instrument of incarceration as a remedy. Resources flowed toward interdiction, into the Drug Enforcement Administration, and into programs that militarized police units across municipalities, subsidized the use of SWAT teams, and encouraged a posture of seizure and surrender rather than harm reduction. Strategy, logistics, and scale matter in that story. It was not only the law on the books, but the machinery of enforcement. Asset forfeiture allowed property to be seized, sometimes on the thinnest of suspicions. Intelligence sharing networks grew between federal and local agencies. Fingerprint databases and arrest records spread. The courtroom became a factory fed by low-level arrests. Arrests for marijuana possession ballooned. Tens of thousands of convictions slowly accumulated into hundreds of thousands. Policy that had begun in neighborhoods became an industry in law enforcement. The practical consequences extended into life plans. People lost jobs, housing, political rights. Families were reorganized around conviction records, and the effects were starkly unequal. Data and ethnographies show what even casual attention would reveal. Enforcement focused, with systematic bias, on Black and Latino communities. Usage rates were often roughly equal across racial groups, but arrests and incarcerations were disproportionately concentrated in communities of color. The result was a social geography of punishment that reconfigured American criminal justice and festooned it with racial inequalities that persist and deepen. The rhetoric that accompanied these campaigns sometimes betrayed political motives. Decades later, an aide to Nixon would be quoted as saying the drug war had been a political tool to discredit dissenting groups and to target Black Americans. Intentions are complex and contested, but the outcomes were plain in the numbers and in the neighborhoods where policemen and prosecutors concentrated their attention. It was sobering to watch the machinery of a criminal justice system designed to address violent crime become the prime engine for managing low-level cannabis possession. The plant that once made a quiet appearance in cultural life now sat at the center of a punitive network. Resistance did not disappear. It mutated and spread into new forms. The old beatniks and folk revivalists had been replaced by new, more organized advocacy. NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, founded in 1970, lobbied for legalization and decriminalization, and provided legal and political frames that would influence a generation of activists. Civil disobedience flourished at particular moments. The 1970s and 80s saw referenda that sometimes pushed back at municipal levels. Oregon decriminalized possession in 1973, the first state to do so legislatively, a small but important crack in a national edifice. For patients, activism took on other, more urgent forms. The mid-1980s and early 1990s witnessed a humanitarian turn to the politics of cannabis. People with AIDS, suffering, wasting and nausea and pain, found in cannabis a relief that modern palliative care often failed to provide. The image of the activist as caregiver became prominent. Mary Jane Rathbun, known affectionately as Brownie Mary in San Francisco, is emblematic of this shift. A volunteer and baker of healing sweets, she distributed cannabis-laden brownies to AIDS patients and was arrested repeatedly. She is remembered now as a figure whose kindness collided with law. Dennis Peron, a Vietnam veteran and gay rights activist, galvanized patient networks into more durable political formations. He helped found the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club and later co-authored California's initiative that would change the nation's legal landscape. Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act of 1996. In the autumn of 1996, California voters, frightened by the images of people dying and moved by stories of relief, passed Prop 215. For the first time in modern American history, a state enshrined by popular vote the right of patients to use cannabis with a physician's recommendation. It was not a total victory. It was an opening, a recognition that law could be reimagined to respect medical decision-making against the grain of federal prohibition. Prop 215 did something else. It exposed a contradiction in the American legal edifice. The federal government still insisted on cannabis as Schedule 1. Federal law allowed prosecutions even where a state statute had authorized use. The clash between federal supremacy and state reform would shape the next 2 decades. Early test cases pushed those tensions into the courts. The Supreme Court, in United States v. of Oakland Cannabis Buyers Cooperative, 2001, refused to accept a medical necessity defense against federal drug trafficking statutes. 4 years later, in Gonzalez v. Reich, 2005, the court held that Congress had the authority under the Commerce Clause to prohibit local cultivation and possession of the marijuana, even if the marijuana had been grown purely for home, non-commercial medicinal use and was approved by state law. These decisions did not nullify states' capacity to create programs. They did, however, signal that federal enforcement might intrude whenever it chose. The practical effect was bewildering for patients and entrepreneurs alike. Dispensaries, originally buyers' clubs run by volunteers and activists, were now pressed into a quasi-commercial model. They needed supply, storage, security, patient registries, and accountants who could understand the fraught logic of cash transactions under a prohibition that forbade banking. States designed regulatory scaffolds with counting rules and license categories: caregiver, grower, processor, dispensary, transport. But they were improvisatory, a patchwork born of urgency rather than forethought. Many early programs were built on good intentions and improvisation. Local clinicians wrote recommendations without a clear pharmaceutical framework, and regulators struggled to design testing standards and safeguards. Patients struggled with inconsistent quality. Some products were crude, poorly labelled, uneven. Some were excellent. The lack of standardization threatened the credibility of the medical project. The federal government's posture shifted at moments, offering temporary respites followed by renewed assertiveness. In the late 2000s and early 2010s, memoranda from the Department of Justice, the Ogden Memorandum in 2009 under the Obama administration, and the Cole Memorandum in 2013, advised federal prosecutors to prioritize serious crime and to avoid targeting individuals complying with state medical laws, provided the regulatory schemes were robust. It was not legalization, it was selective forbearance. Most patients and industry advocates took it as a recognition of the reality on the ground. Sensible-sounding memos do not, however, alter statutes. They can be rescinded. In 2018, the then Attorney General Jeff Sessions rescinded the Cole memo, restoring more latitude to federal prosecutors. The oscillation of policy reflected not only legal complexity, but the political calculation that cannabis still occupied, in the eyes of many legislators and officials, an electoral and moral battleground. Meanwhile, the science continued to march. With receptors mapped and endogenous ligands found, the endocannabinoid system became a new field of biology. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, researchers identified specific receptors: CB1 receptors concentrated in the brain's basal ganglia, hippocampus and cerebellum, and CB2 receptors in immune tissues, and then, crucially, clamped their molecular identities down by cloning their genes. The narrative of discovery is tidy but cumulative. Early binding studies in the late 80s suggested the existence of a receptor. The gene that encodes the brain cannabinoid receptor was cloned around 1990. Peripheral receptor, CB2, appeared in papers in the early 90s. Those discoveries reframed cannabis research in a profound way. THC was no longer simply an exogenous drug. It was a key to a biological system that already governed appetite, memory, pain and inflammation. The story deepened when the body revealed its own cannabinoids. In 1992, researchers reported the isolation of an endogenous ligand that bound to the cannabinoid receptor. They named it anandamide, from the Sanskrit ananda, bliss, a scientific and almost mischievous little joke that captured the quality of discovery. A second major endogenous ligand, 2-arachidonyl glycerol, 2-AG, would be characterized in the mid-90s. These molecules were not stored and released like classical neurotransmitters. They were synthesized on demand, short-lived messengers that moved backward across synapses in a mechanism called retrograde signaling to dampen presynaptic neurotransmitter release. The endocannabinoid system thus emerged as a regulator of homeostasis, a fine-tuning instrument the brain used to modulate excitability and to respond to stress, injury, and metabolic needs. The surge of knowledge produced both hope and caution. On the one hand, the idea that manipulating the endocannabinoid system could relieve pain, reduce spasticity, curb chemotherapy-related nausea, or protect neurons from some forms of injury suggested therapeutic horizons. Clinical programs built on that promise. Dronabinol had been approved in the 80s as an antiemetic and appetite stimulant for AIDS patients. Synthetic analogues and plant-derived medicines, among them the Sativex ormocosal spray developed by GW Pharmaceuticals, combining THC and CBD and used to treat spasticity, entered national formularies in a handful of countries. On the other hand, the system's ubiquity made it perilous ground for blunt pharmacological manipulation. A drug called rimonabant, developed as a CB1 inverse agonist to curb appetite and treat obesity, initially found favour in Europe in the mid-2000s, but was withdrawn amid psychiatric side effects, depression and suicidality. The lesson was stark. To tinker with the body's tonal regulators is to risk breaking the music. Homeostasis is delicate. Clinical manipulation requires a surgeon's steadiness rather than a sledgehammer. The technical advances of the endocannabinoid revolution were matched by the expansion of a political and medical movement that would change laws state by state. California's Prop 215 served as both a blueprint and a clarion call. In the decade following its passage, voter initiatives, legislative acts, and judicial rulings produced a mosaic of state-level medical marijuana programs across the United States. Oregon, Washington, Alaska had earlier flirtations with decriminalization. Later in the 90s and 2000s, many states followed California's model or created their own versions. Registries for patients, ID cards, limits on possession, caregiver exemptions, regulated dispensaries. Some states allowed home cultivation, others forbade it. Some listed specific qualifying conditions. Some allowed physicians broad discretion. The result was a patchwork that confounded researchers who wanted uniform protocols and confused businesses that sought predictable markets. Designing these programs required grappling with practicalities few politicians enjoy: supply chains, quality control, testing labs, packaging that prevented accidental ingestion, rules to protect youth, taxation schemes, and law enforcement priorities. Many early programs lacked robust laboratory oversight. Tests for potency and contaminant screening were spotty. Labeling was inconsistent. These lacunae raised real concerns for clinicians trying to recommend a botanical product without the strictures of dose standardization that the pharmaceutical world expects. The tension between botanical variability and pharmaceutical rigor remains, in many ways, unresolved. Civil society rose to meet gaps. Advocacy organizations like the Marijuana Policy Project and later Americans for Safe Access provided legal support, lobbied for ballot measures, and helped states design regulations. Local activists who had been caregivers turned into entrepreneurs. Patient collectives evolved into licensed dispensaries. The commercial impulse intermingled with medical activism, and the line between compassionate care and market participation blurred. That blurring would later fuel critiques that the medical label had been used as a foothold for commercial legalization. Defenders replied that patient needs had only ever been human and immediate. Scientific evidence accrued alongside this political ferment. Randomized controlled trials were not easy to mount under Schedule 1 restrictions, but the evidence base expanded. Cannabinoids showed efficacy as antiemetics and appetite stimulants, with dronabinol and nabilone as examples. Nabiximols had measurable effects for some patients with spasticity. CBD would later demonstrate efficacy in reducing seizures in specific pediatric epileptic syndromes, leading to the approval of Epidiolex in 2018 in the United States. For chronic pain, neuropathic pain, and numerous other indications, the picture was mixed. Some trials showed modest benefits, others not, and the evidence often sat at the moderate to low end by conventional hierarchies. Side effects too were real. Cognitive disruption, dizziness, potential for dependency with heavy, sustained use, and the worrisome association between adolescent heavy use and increased risk for later psychosis in vulnerable individuals. Medicine proceeded as it must, cautiously with randomized trials where possible, and with the persistent realization that a plant's chemistry is complex and human biology is variable. Legal tensions persisted because a federal statute hung like a ceiling over every state reform. Banks were reluctant to accept deposits from cannabis businesses for fear of money laundering statutes. This forced many dispensaries to operate as cash businesses, creating security risks and tax complexities. Researchers found themselves navigating a labyrinth of approvals, DEA registration, FDA protocols, NIH oversight. The single supplier model for federally sanctioned research, long reliant on a single government farm for botanical stock, limited the strains and chemotypes available for study, further muddying the science. Activists and clinicians argued that federal prohibition strangled evidence gathering and delayed public health improvements. Opponents argued that the slow march toward acceptance ignored unknown harms and lacked sufficient long-run data. By the early 2010s, the landscape had shifted enough that two states, Colorado and Washington, in 2012 legally recognized adult recreational use, creating an entirely new set of regulatory problems: retail licensing, age verification, advertising rules, taxation models tied to potency or price, and new public health concerns regarding driving under the influence and youth access. The regulatory imagination had to stretch from medical recommendation to public consumption. Where could marijuana be sold? How should it be taxed? What educational campaigns would prevent youth initiation? Cities and counties experimented with zoning, with social equity provisions to remediate communities most affected by the war on drugs, and with licensing regimes designed to prevent monopolies while ensuring product safety. The practicalities of rolling out a legal market after decades of prohibition were vast. The logistical task of converting criminal markets into regulated commerce required lawyers, lab technicians, municipal planners, and a lot of patience. Across these decades, the political conversation matured from moral panic to something more pragmatic. Where once the plant was largely an emblem of deviance or a pretext for punitive enforcement, it had become a site of therapeutic possibility, a subject of sober neurochemical inquiry, and, inevitably, a commodity. Those three identities, illicit vice, medicine, and market product, do not sit easily together. They press against one another. They reshape law and livelihoods and scientific priorities. The story of marijuana in the late 20th and early 21st centuries is less a tale of a single thread than of braided currents. Scientific discovery, penal policy, and patient activism each pulled in different directions, sometimes in harmony, often in tension. In the laboratory, the discovery of THC and the later mapping of receptors and endogenous ligands rewrote biology in a few dozen years. The plant migrated from herbal law into molecular neurobiology. In the streets and courts, countercultural plant smoke and punitive laws turned into a vast punitive apparatus that remade social geographies and punished whole communities. In clinics and town halls, the stories of patients, some momentary, some devastatingly long, reshaped public sympathy and created legal openings for reform. The end result is a fragmented architecture, a patchwork of laws, a still evolving evidence base, and a public policy conversation that swings between compassion and caution, between market opportunity and social justice. It is easy, in the fast tides of headlines, to reduce these movements to caricature. The stoned rebel, the repressive cop, the cold-eyed farmer executive, the saintly caregiver. History is obliged to be more patient. It watches the slow accretion of data and decisions, the shaping of policy by logistics and law as much as ideology. It notes the laboratories where a chemist's first coaxed a molecule into view, and the courtrooms where judges decided that federal law trumped state compassion. It sits with the regulators who struggle to design a testing protocol, and with the families who found, in a small edible or a measured capsule, a fragment of relief. At night, when the city has shut its great maw of commerce and policy and research for a while, the threads of the story hang like a constellation. The chemical discoveries of the post-war years opened possibilities no one could have fully predicted. Not only new medicines, but also new ethical dilemmas about bodily autonomy, equity, and the limits of punishment. The counterculture that popularized cannabis in the streets made the government respond with force. The patients who marched and sued and voted shifted public opinion in ways laws could not immediately absorb. The result is a legal and scientific landscape that is, even now, under construction. A human project of regulation, research, and redress, shaped by laboratories smelling of solvents and by kitchen tables where brownies were baked for neighbours in pain. The endocannabinoid revolution taught scientists humility and gave clinicians tools. It taught politicians something different, that biology and law do not always make tidy companions. The war on drugs taught the nation that broad, punitive strategies produce consequences that reverberate for decades. The medical marijuana movement taught us that patience, when organised and visible, can change the law, but also that a patchwork of reform creates practical difficulties for research, for safety, and for equitable access. These are not tidy lessons. They are, however, the bones of a story that continues to breathe, each discovery and decision a soft exhalation into the long night of policy and practice. The international architecture that came to govern cannabis is a careful creaking thing, assembled over decades of conferences, petitions, colonial anxieties and medical reports, and it began in slow and earnest fits with the League of Nations and a mid-20s diplomacy that smelled of coal and ink and the perfume of compromise. In Geneva in 1925, the question of hashish and Indian hemp was put on the table. Egypt, with vivid accounts of social damage, pushed for prohibition, while India, tasked with administering a vast colonial population, argued for restraint and local controls. The result was neither a clean ban nor a free-for-all, but a set of constraints, limits on trade, record-keeping obligations, and an international expectation that states would restrict non-medical uses. It was a compromise written into treaties with the deliberate slowness of diplomats who know how fragile unanimity is, and who prefer an ugly accord to open conflict. That early architecture was later folded into the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961, a treaty that remains the backbone of the international drug control system. Signed in New York at the height of post-war multilateralism, the Single Convention sought to simplify a patchwork of prior agreements and to enshrine the principle that certain controlled substances, cannabis among them, should be limited to medical and scientific use. The drafters created schedules, the legal equivalent of shelves. Substances deemed particularly dangerous or lacking therapeutic utility were put on the most restrictive shelves. Cannabis, because of the way the politics of the moment tilted towards caution, and because of incomplete science, found itself placed under severe limitations, effectively equating it, for regulatory purposes, with far more tightly controlled opiates. The treaty created institutions too: the International Narcotics Control Board, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, bureaucratic custodians whose job was to watch production, to tally statistics, to approve exports and imports, to ask perpetual questions about quotas and legitimate medical need. There were mechanisms of compliance, and there were penalties in the moral register of the international system: naming and shaming, diplomatic pressure, occasional public admonition. Enforcement, the lawyers later admitted, was a matter of national will. The board had teeth only insofar as states granted them. The 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances and the 1988 Convention Against Illicit Traffic broadened that web, adding synthetic compounds and a set of anti-trafficking obligations that shifted emphasis toward criminal law, asset forfeiture, and cooperation in interdiction. By the time the century closed, the architecture surrounding cannabis was dense, technical, and, for many, inflexible. It assumed a single model of the world. Substances were either legitimate for medicine and science, or they were illicit, and national authorities were supposed to sort production into neat lanes. This made sense to treaty lawyers. It made politics harder. Then, beginning in the late 20th century and accelerating in the 21st, the world changed. Science nudged at received judgments. Raphael Mechoulam's isolation of THC in 1964 and the slow patient lab work that followed had planted seeds. Patient stories did the rest. Accounts of relief for chronic pain, for chemotherapy-induces nausea, for seizure disorders like the early publicized cases of children with intractable epilepsy. These stories did what reports and tables sometimes cannot. They humanized the issue. In the United States, California's Proposition 215 in 1996 opened a door. It was small at first, a state-level medical exemption, but it functioned like an experiment that other states watched over the fence. Canada's medical marijuana access regulations in 1999 were another entanglement of state policy and medical provision, and the Dutch coffee shop system, implicitly tolerated since 1976, kept its own quiet pressure on the conversation. Portugal's decriminalisation in 2001 reframed drug control around health rather than punishment, and each national experiment added pressure to the international edifice. The strains between treaty obligations and national innovations were practical and legal. Uruguay's 2013 law, passed under President José Mujica, opened the possibility of a fully regulated domestic market for adult use. Home-growing cannabis clubs, state-regulated sales through pharmacies. Uruguay did not denounce the single convention. It argued its scheme fell within the treaty's allowances because it tightly controlled distribution and sought to reduce illicit trafficking. Canada's decision, under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, to legalise adult use in October 2018 produced similar tension. A G7 nation, long a defender of multilateral treaties, had enacted a national statutory regime that plainly diverged from the strict textual spirit of 1961. In the United States, the picture became mosaic. Beginning with Washington and Colorado in 2012, state after state enacted reforms, medical, then adult use, while the federal government retained cannabis as a Schedule I substance. For years, the International Narcotics Control Board issued statements reminding states of their international obligations. The board's language was stern, sometimes paternal. But diplomatic rebukes have limited bite. Treaties bind through domestic law and political will. They do not, in modern practice, compel a state to choose between its domestic policy innovations and continued membership. And yet the international system has not been utterly immune to change. The mechanics of bureaucracy, slow, methodical, almost reluctant, began to respond to a stronger current of scientific reassessment and political pressure. The World Health Organization's Expert Committee on Drug Dependence undertook a formal review of cannabis and related substances beginning in the late 2010s. Its work was painstaking, an inventory of studies, a review of therapeutic potential, a weighing of risk. The committee's recommendations, issued after long deliberation, asked the Commission on Narcotic Drugs to reconsider the placement of cannabis and cannabis resin on the single convention's schedules and to remove particularly harsh categorical stigma from materials that science had begun, albeit imperfectly, to contextualize. The Commission met in a year unlike many others. In December 2020, member states, in a signal of how norms can drift, accepted, by vote, a WHO recommendation to remove cannabis and cannabis resin from the harshest of the single convention's lists, Schedule 4, or while leaving it subject to control in Schedule 1. It was not a liberal triumph, it was rather a bureaucratic recalibration. The plant was not legalised internationally by that decision, but the vote marked a symbolic and procedural shift. The international community, in the teeth of national reforms and patient advocacy, conceded that prior scheduling had been too blunt an instrument, that medicinal value and harm potential required more careful accounting. What this meant in practice was complicated. The treaties were not swept away. States that had legalised recreational use remained formally at odds with the single convention's letter. Yet multilateral processes and the very existence of the WHO review signalled that the architecture could be nudged. The 2016 United Nations General Assembly Special Session on Drugs, scarcely remembered as a drama but important as ritual, had already invited member states to reflect on health, human rights and development when constructing drug policies. Voices that had long been marginalised, public health researchers, civil society groups, advocates for people harmed by mass incarceration, began to matter in diplomatic corridors as much as representatives from law enforcement ministries. It is odd and reassuring in a bureaucratic way that treaties born of mid-century command and control thinking have been forced to yield to local politics, scientific reassessment and a changing moral imagination. International norms constrain national innovation. They did not, in the end, stop it. From those treaty tensions, the modern cannabis industry grew slowly at first, and then with a speed that startled regulators and investors alike. Legalization in Uruguay and the state-level moves in the United States were episodes. Canada's 2018 national law was the event that made the market legible on a global scale. When a high-income country with federal regulation opens a legal market, capital notices. Investors in Toronto and London and on Wall Street, pension funds, venture capitalists, and a constellation of small private players began in the late 2010s to chase what journalists called the green rush. Firms raised capital on public exchanges in Canada where the national regulator allowed listings. Companies like Canopy Growth, Aurora Cannabis, Tilray and Cronos became marquee names, their valuations buoyed by optimistic forecasts of global demand and cross-border export opportunities. The reality, less photogenic, was that treaties and national laws constrained trade. Exporting recreational cannabis to countries where it remained illegal was not a simple arbitrage. The markets therefore bifurcated. Medical supply chains, where export could be argued under treaty for legitimate medical use, were viable for cross-border commerce. Recreational markets, by contrast, had to be domestically contained. Retail models multiplied like branches of a restless tree. Some jurisdictions embraced state control. Norway briefly flirted with models of monopolised distribution, and some Canadian provinces initially retrained retail under Crown corporations. Others permitted private licensure, a carrot for entrepreneurs and a challenge for regulators. The United States coagulated multiple models, some states limiting vertical integration to prevent single firms from dominating cultivation, others allowing multi-state operators to own cultivation, processing and retail. Where capital was deep, corporate firms consolidated. Multi-state operators, MSOs, emerged, with names like Curaleaf, Truliev, Cresco Labs and Green Thumb Industries in this American landscape. Public companies in Canada and the United States sought scale, believing volume and brand recognition would win customers away from long-entrenched illicit markets. Branding and product innovation came hand in hand. The industry learned quickly that it was not enough to sell a dried flower. Consumers wanted choices, edibles, tinctures, vape cartridges, transdermal patches, concentrates like shatter and alive resin, and companies supplied an expanding palette. Packaging began to look like the packaging of any other consumer sector. Matte, boxes, logo marks, lifestyle photography, until regulators stepped in, fussed at brand appeal, and imposed plain packaging or strict limits on labels in order to protect youth and public health. That regulatory tension is persistent. Public health authorities want to limit marketing, while firms, by their nature, seek attention and growth. The cigarette industry's playbook became a cautionary tale. Nicotine turned out to be a profitable and socially corrosive product, and many regulators behaved as if they had read that history and did not want a repeat. Investment flows were volatile. The early excitement in Toronto and Nasdaq launched balloon valuations. Constellation Brands, a major alcohol company, invested heavily in Canopy. Altria, the tobacco giant, bought into Kronos. Constellation and other large food and drink firms examined the sector with the kind of curiosity that signals a potential shake-up. Yet the market also cooled. Oversupply, regulatory delays, slow retail rollouts, provincial licensing in Canada proceeded unevenly, and the persistence of black markets that undercut legal prices forced a reckoning. Many firms tightened, consolidated, or pivoted to medicinal or hemp CBD products. The hemp story deserves its own paragraph. The 2018 US Farm Bill removed hemp, defined as cannabis with less than 0.3% THC, from the Controlled Substances Act, and overnight a vast new market for CBD in foods, cosmetics and supplements opened. The FDA, for its part, looked less enthused about ingestible CBD products and issued cautionary statements. Regulatory uncertainty became the dominant theme. Regulatory frameworks for product and market oversight evolved into elaborate systems, seed-to-sale tracking software, testing protocols for contaminants and potency, age verification rules, child-proof packaging mandates, and taxation schemes designed simultaneously to deter youth use and to produce government revenue. Excise taxes were common, so were local licensing fees. The arithmetic of taxation became a political issue. Set taxes too high and the illicit market thrives. Set them too low and public coffers fail to capture value and regulators lose leverage. Many governments tried to thread that needle with mixed success. Banking was another knot. In the United States, federal illegality meant most cannabis businesses could not use ordinary banks. They operated largely in cash, a situation that invited theft and made compliance with anti-money laundering rules arduous. In 2014, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network issued guidance to banks willing to work with marijuana-related businesses, but it imposed heavy reporting burdens. The Safe Banking Act, an effort in Congress to provide a statutory safe harbor for banks, passed the House several times but stalled in the Senate. That failure did not merely inconvenience accountants, it shaped who could succeed in the market. Well-financed firms with access to alternative credit won. Small entrepreneurs, often from communities harmed by years of enforcement, found the capital landscape an unforgiving place. And there, precisely, is where the industry's story collides with questions of equity. Social equity programs emerged as a regulatory response to two linked moral facts: that enforcement for decades had disproportionately targeted certain communities, and that the profits from legalization should not flow only to those who already had wealth. Illinois' Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act of 2019 explicitly tied licensing and reinvestment to equity goals and built-in provisions for expungement. California's Proposition 64 included language about resentencing, and local programs in Oakland, Los Angeles, and elsewhere tried, sometimes successfully, often clumsily, to prioritize applicants from impacted neighborhoods. Yet good intentions ran into realities. Licensing processes demanded business plans, proof of capital, and compliance with complex rules. Many applicants from historically targeted communities lacked access to the kind of startup capital that angels and venture firms supply. Cities and states tried to build incubator programs and grant funds, and a few jurisdictions experimented with community ownership models, but the structural inertia of capital and legal competence often ensured that large, well-backed firms expanded fastest. There are practical consequences to these governance choices. Heavy-handed prohibition had concentrated harms in targeted communities. Legal markets can correct those injustices, but can also entrench new economic hierarchies. The tobacco industry's history with black communities in the United States and alcohol industry consolidation elsewhere provide cautionary reference points. The worst of predictions, an industry that reproduces the same patterns of marketing and concentration as tobacco, remains possible. So does the best-case scenario, a regulated market that keeps products out of children's hands, funds public health programs, offers pathways for entrepreneurs from impacted communities, and slowly shrinks illicit supply without entrenching inequality. The outcome will hinge on specific policy choices, licensing design, tax policy, access to capital, and a willingness to invest in reparation. Which brings us finally to the contested terrain of present-day debates, where health evidence, social justice imperatives, and market incentives all convene and sometimes quarrel. On the health front, the record is mixed and, crucially, still forming. There is clear evidence that certain cannabinoid-based medicines can help. The FDA approved synthetic THC in the 80s for chemotherapy-induced nausea, and the 2018 approval of Epidiolex, a purified CBD product for rare pediatric epilepsies, is a milestone that moved cannabinoids into mainstream pharmacology. Nabiximols, marketed as Sativex, has been authorized in many countries for spasticity related to multiple sclerosis. For chronic non-cancer pain and neuropathic pain, systematic reviews show modest benefits for some patients, small effect sizes against placebo, and a difficulty in translating trial conditions to everyday use. The nuance matters. Cannabinoids are not a panacea, but for subsets of patients, where traditional therapies failed or were poorly tolerated, the relief can be significant and life-changing. Policy must therefore encourage rigorous randomized trials, standardization of dose and formulation, and longer-term surveillance so clinicians can make informed recommendations. Risks are no less real. Heavy early-onset use in adolescence is linked in cohort studies to altered trajectories of cognition for some individuals, and vulnerable brains may be particularly sensitive. The association between cannabis use, especially of high THC preparations, and psychosis is complex and probabilistic. Cannabis is not a deterministic cause, but it appears to be a contributory factor for those already genetically or developmentally at risk. Cannabis use disorder, an established clinical diagnosis, afflicts a minority of users, but as markets grow and potency increases, public health systems must anticipate greater demand for treatment. Impaired driving presents another thorn. Unlike alcohol, where blood alcohol concentration correlates relatively predictably with impairment, THC pharmacokinetics are messy. Active impairment may not map neatly to a blood concentration, and per se limits adopted by some jurisdictions are blunt instruments. Lawmakers have experimented zero-tolerance rules for low levels per se thresholds such as 5 nanograms per milliliter and behavioral impairment tests, but enforcement remains challenging and contentious. Synthetic cannabinoids, the chemically tweaked analogues sold under names like Spice or K2, continue to be a source of acute toxicity and unpredictability. Legislation that bans specific molecules is often outpaced by chemists creating new ones. The danger of synthetic compounds is an object lesson in regulation. Where a legal market is narrow or inaccessible, illicit producers may supply a dangerous alternative. The 2019 outbreak of e-cigarette, or vaping, associated lung injury, EVAE, in the United States, an episode linked largely to vitamin E acetate in illicit THC cartridges, was a grim reminder of what happens when supply routes are unregulated and quality control absent. The bulk of severe EVAE cases were connected to illicit products, a fact that proponents of regulated markets cite as evidence that careful oversight can save lives. The politics of justice, too, are central. Decades of enforcement left records, families and communities scarred by arrests and convictions that often carried consequences in housing, employment and civic standing. Expungement and record sealing have thus become policy priorities in many legalization frameworks. California, Illinois and other jurisdictions have set statutory paths for clearing records and creating set-aside licensing. Yet the work of reparative justice goes beyond paperwork. True reparations require capital, market access, technical assistance and time. If legalization merely opens doors for well-capitalized actors, while leaving impacted communities with a few small grants, the transformative promise is not realised. There are hopeful experiments, community benefit agreements, publicly funded loans targeted at formerly incarcerated entrepreneurs, and cooperative ownership models that aim to rebalance opportunities, but they require political will and sustained funding. Which brings us, at last, to the road ahead, which is best seen as a set of plausible futures rather than a single prophecy. One path is the regulatory public health model. Careful limits on advertising, strict age controls, robust testing and labelling, reasonable taxation to suppress youth demand while undercutting illicit markets, and expansive social equity measures to repair past harms. In that scenario, markets exist but are constrained. Innovation continues in product design and medicine. Research accelerates through improved access and legal clarity, and harms are managed rather than denied. Another path is the commercialized model. Aggressive corporate consolidation, marketing that pushes high-potency products, and a contest between profit motives and public health advocates that, unless checked, could replicate patterns we have seen with alcohol and tobacco: higher consumption among some groups, targeted marketing, and uneven attention to equity. A third, more geopolitically consequential trajectory would be a reworked international law, treaty amendments, or a new interpretive consensus at the UN that allow regulated international trade in medical and adult use cannabis. This is technically possible but politically fraught. It would require a reimagining of the single convention's assumptions and a willingness by some conservative states to loosen strictures. Science will help determine which of these tracks we find ourselves on. Better trials, clearer data on long-term outcomes, more nuanced understandings of cannabinoid pharmacology, and refined public health interventions will give policymakers tools, but tools are only as useful as the values that guide them. Law will matter. Banking reform, clear licensing that privileges equity, workplace protections, and driving performances tests calibrated to impairment, not merely presence of metabolites, could change the balance. Culture will matter too. How societies narrate use, who is allowed to participate in the market, and whether victims of past policies are acknowledged and aided, will mark the moral tone of legalization. If you let the imagination wander for a moment and allow the historian's eye to notice small things, you will see cities where storefronts are mixed, clinics offering cannabinoid-based medicines next to cooperatively owned dispensaries, community centres offering job training funded by excise revenue, and public health campaigns that speak plainly about risks. You will see labs in Colombia or Israel developing standardized botanical medicines for export under transparent international protocols. You will see lawsuits and corporate contests. You will see banks, eventually, reluctantly offering services as federal regimes shift. You will also see, in darker corners, the persistence of illicit markets, the occasional scandal when a firm cuts corners, and the old habits of targeted policing reasserting themselves unless societies remain vigilant. The point to remember, as Jeffrey's creak and markets bloom and public health experts argue in journals, is that the story of cannabis is not simply a story of a plant, but of governance at scale, of how societies decide what is commerce and what is health, which harms to prioritize, which debts to acknowledge and repay. It is a story that asks whether we will regulate to minimize harm, distribute economic opportunity fairly, and support scientific inquiry, or whether we'll permit a new, orderly commercialization to displace those aims with profit-driven normality. The future is not predetermined. It is a set of policy choices, each carrying its own texture. The scratch of a pen at the licensing desk, the quiet whir of an extraction centrifuge, the dull thud of a gavel sealing an expungement, the bright neon of a dispensary at dusk. Choose carefully. History will record what we did, and how softly or how clumsily we tried to repair what prohibition broke.